Namaste.
Namaste.
When I first chose this topic, I didn't really realize where I would end up going with it, but that happens a lot. We are, as a people, obsessed with the ideas of cleanliness and defilement. We like rules. And if you look at the origins of rules in spiritual traditions, they often, I believe, originated in things that were pretty much common sense for the time, that evolved out of things people noticed as they lived. And then as religion started to develop, a lot of those things were then attributed to God to make sure that they would be enforced. One of the most obvious ones is washing your hands. Probably the early Hebrew people discovered that there was some benefit to washing your hands, at least before you ate. They may have even figured out that for some reason you got sick less often if you washed your hands. And so Moses goes up the mountain and comes back with 10 commandments, and the religious authorities add several hundred more to it, including things like washing your hands. And there's nothing wrong with washing your hands. It's a pretty good idea, actually. But the question is, does it change your spiritual standing or your spiritual evolution? The Jewish people probably decided not to eat pork because they looked around pre-refrigeration and discovered that a lot of people who ate pork got sick. And so it became a pretty good common sense idea not to eat pork, but Moses goes up the mountain, comes down, they start cogitating about what all of those 10 things might mean, and all of a sudden, no pork. The same is true of shellfish. People are allergic to shellfish. And so I really believe that some of those rules came out of things that were already existing, cultural practices. And all of a sudden, if we attribute them to God, maybe more people will pay attention to them. Which isn't a bad thing. Until you get to the place where you start to understand where these things come from. And I recently read an article that suggested that the way that the Hebrew Bible is categorized by the Jewish people is a decent way to look at spiritual growth. And generally speaking, the Hebrew people talk about the Old Testament in terms of the law, which are the first 5 books of the Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, which, it's, Abraham sacrifices Isaac almost. Moses leads the people out of the desert and gets the 10 commandments, and then it's elaboration on those 10 commandments. So you've got rules. And then they talk about the prophets. Isaiah, Jeremiah, the 12 so-called minor prophets, just because their books are shorter, who started to do social commentary, to look at what was going on in their world, and what they really were trying to do was explain why it is their belief that if you followed the rules, good things would happen to you, didn't seem to be working out the way that they thought it would. And so they started to talk about things like, how do we treat the poor? How do we run our courts places of justice? And then the third classification of books in the Old Testament are the wisdom books. Psalms, Proverbs, the Book of Wisdom, Ecclesiastes, Ecclesiasticus. And I think a good way to understand those books is that they came out of the direct experience of God. Which doesn't mean that they're perfect, but it means that people started to have something that we might call mystical experience. And so they started to write from a different perspective. Now, I want to say that that's a microcosm of human development. That if you look at the reading from the Diamond Sutra we had first, it's talking about going from the rules, to getting to the place where you're totally free. And now you don't look at the rules anymore because you're able to see clearly without the benefit of it. So what if the law, those first 5 books, that need for the rules is, and there's no way to talk about this that doesn't sound pejorative, but I'm not being critical. Everybody needs to go through the phases. That's elementary school. You learn the stories. You learn that it's a good idea not to kill your neighbor, which is probably, pretty sound reasoning. Nobody's going to argue with that. That it's probably not a good idea to rob the local gas station or the bank, So you get some basic frameworks around which, hopefully, people live together in society more effectively. Nobody gets hurt. For the most part, people get what they want. It's interesting when you look, though, at some of those systems, like particularly the Jewish law. The prohibition against murder was only about killing other Jewish people. And if you slipped up and killed one, there were still cities of refuge you could run to. They were kind of like the get out of jail free card in Monopoly. If you could get there before their family caught you, you were safe. So, and somehow that gets lost in contemporary interpretation of that, which isn't a bad thing. I'm not all for saying, Madison is a city of refuge. Kill whoever you want, get on 94, and you can beat the family there. It's okay. But maybe knowledge of those little exceptions and caveats helps us understand that even in the beginning, those rules weren't quite so hard and fast. Why didn't you covet your neighbor's wife? And why is that in the same sentence as coveting his ox and his ass? Well, because she was his property. So maybe we don't want to hold that one up in quite the same way. And seeing that is a part of spiritual growth. So we start out in spiritual grade school. And eventually, we spend enough time looking at the rules and we live enough of life and we start to see situations where the rules don't apply. One of the classic philosophical, ethical questions is, you're married to somebody, they have an illness, you can't afford the medicine, but the medicine's at the pharmacy. Do you break into the pharmacy to get the medicine? Now, on the one hand, it's stealing. On the other hand, it's saving a life. And when you start to see that the rules aren't quite so black and white, you move into what I'm going to call spiritual high school. Middle school being that period where everybody's so awkward I don't even want to think about it. So we'll just jump right into high school. And in spiritual high school, you start to move into that prophetic voice. Those books in the Old Testament, if you will, where you look at what goes on in the world around you and start thinking about issues of fairness. You start seeing that the world is not really made up of 2 choices, one's right and one's wrong, but that there's really many choices available. It becomes a little more complex. You start moving from a place where you say the police are always right to a place like Ferguson, Missouri, where you start to question what the proper use of power and authority is in a culture. It's getting to a place that's a lot more uncomfortable because when you get there, you have to give up certainty. And everybody loves certainty. But is certainty a reality? Or is certainty just an idea? How many things can we ever really be absolutely sure about? Even the boiling point of water. If we throw some salt in the water, it changes. So you get to that prophetic place and you start being critical, generally speaking, of a lot of the things we see at first. This isn't right, that isn't right, that isn't right. But eventually you come to start to realize that it's not enough to be critical. Anybody can point out a broken toaster. There's a certain amount of wisdom that's required to make it work again. Anybody can point out a broken system, but there's a certain amount of wisdom and cooperation that's required to make the system work again. And in theory then, you move from the rules to that position of being something of a social critic, which doesn't abandon the rules, it incorporates them. And eventually the goal is you move to what I'm going to call spiritual college, which is the wisdom works. Those encounters we have that are direct encounters of the transcendent, of the divine, of God, of whatever word you want to put to it. Whether the encounters are experiences in nature, experiences as a result of spiritual practice, experiences that are the result of, I think, life transformation, stages of transformation. Being present at a birth can do it for some people. Others just pass out. Sometimes it's being present at a death. Sometimes it's the most mundane things in the world where all of a sudden we get a sense that we see things clearly, although it doesn't last, but we see things clearly in glimpses. And we start to move then into that wisdom stage. Now, where the analogy starts to break down is that elementary school is a pretty defined thing, and so is high school, and so is university, and you can't really be both in elementary school and in high school at the same time. But in terms of spiritual development, we don't just leap from one stage to another, we sort of slide across. And every time we get in trouble or in crisis, we tend to take a step back to what's sure and certain. And that's why you see people, my favorite example is people who have, here comes the airplane, people who have, we'll just let that pass. People who have set, it's not so close today, people who have set aside spiritual practices, people who've, the rosary's been in the drawer for 10 years, and mother gets a diagnosis, and it comes back up. There's nothing wrong with that, it's very normal, it's going back to what we know in times of uncertainty. And so it's a much more fluid thing than really the school system is. But the really difficult thing in practical application is that most churches are doing grade school on Sunday morning, and I want to say they have to, because you never know who comes in the door. And if somebody completely new comes in the door and they walk into a physics class, they're going to leave. They're going to leave. I mean, even if I was around for a long time, if I walked into a physics class, I'd have to leave. So you have to somehow figure out a way to make whatever it is that you do that's your principal thing accessible to everybody, and at the same time let people know that there's more to the whole story than just this. And that's really what spiritual practice is about. And that's where the Eastern traditions have done their job a lot better than the Western. Because in the West we've tried to say, all you need to do is show up on Sunday morning, it's like going to the gas station. Somebody sticks a nozzle into you, they fill you up, you're good for the week, off you go, and you don't need anything more. Well, that's great if you're Jethro from the Beverly Hillbillies and getting to the 6th grade is all you ever needed. But if you want to get further, if you start encountering those situations where the tools you seem to have to deal with life just aren't enough, or your life experience isn't explainable by the tools, you have to start moving a little bit. When the world doesn't make sense, and if a spiritual system doesn't give you the tools you need to take the step, you're going to walk away. And I want to say that explains the great American exodus from church. And it can be fixed, but it takes time, and you also have to be willing to give it more than an hour a week. Meditation and other spiritual practices, including service and study, and what in the world's the other one? Devotional spirituality. Move us into that place of moving up that ladder. And I'm getting to a point where I used to say I hate spiritual models that are ladders and talk about progression. I think we have to look at it that way. If you start going to the food pantry, even once a quarter, and feeding people, you're going to be changed and transformed. You can't help it. If you start doing whatever it is that feeds you. Somebody yesterday told me how when she rides her Harley, she feels closer to God than anywhere else. While she's out in nature, there's a certain rhythm to the engine that's almost mantra-like, and yeah. So whatever it is, when we do it, we start to grow and can't help ourselves. And there will be people who aren't there yet, who don't understand it, and I think then we just need to say that's okay, but we need to do what we need to do. There's also going to be people that have done the things we're doing right now, and done a lot of growing, and they're doing something else now. And that's great for them too. The goal isn't to finish. Unlike school, it's not to get the diploma or the degree or whatever. It's to experience the journey as authentically as we can. And so if somebody needs to not eat pork, super, don't eat pork. But if you're not feeling that way, then do what you need to do. People will only move and shift from the law to the prophet to the wisdom when they're ready. And there's nothing we can do to force them to shift faster. And that's also true about ourselves. We can do our practice, but the shift will occur when it's ready. And our job is really just to be faithful to that encounter wherever we find it. And issues then of cleanliness and defilement become irrelevant because they're very perspective-based, they're very subjective. If I believe that it's wrong for me to show up at church if there's going to be communion and I haven't been fasting for 12 hours, well then for me it's wrong. But for somebody else, if that's what they need to, or if that's not how they feel, we need to allow them the grace to follow their understanding of the divine as it is. Because to me, one of the most effective images of God is a disco ball. Wow. With all of those mirrors. And we're all standing in a slightly different angle, so a different mirror is reflecting that light to us. And rather than be concerned about how the light's striking Aaron, what I really need to worry about is how the light is striking me. Amen.